Spoiler warning, this game is fairly new, so I'm warning you now. I will be discussing this game in its entirety, including the ending and unlockables. If you don't want to be spoiled, I'd highly recommend playing the game for yourself before watching this video. It's only $1 and takes about an hour or two to 100%, so go do that and then come back to this video. You've been warned. Alright? Alright. Do you ever play a game that feels like it was made just for you? A game that plays to every strength that you love and trims all of the fat that you don't to make a perfect video game stew? Toree is that for me. Fast-paced 3D platforming with charming aesthetics, great music, tight controls, short snappy levels, and just enough extra content to round everything out. That's why I'm giving this pair of games the in-depth analysis that they deserve. Toree is more than just a simple indie 3D platformer. Toree is special to me, so today I'm going to break it down to see what makes it tick. First off, some history. Toree 3D was developed by Cyactro, a small studio run almost entirely by Marcus Horn. Marcus has been making small game projects for a while now, with his most notable release being MacBat64, and is part of the Haunted PS1 community. This is a group of indie game devs who share a love of low-poly aesthetics and horror, and they often collaborate on demo discs to show off their works in progress and get feedback from the community. Cyactro had released a few games under the Haunted PS1 umbrella already, and was working on a new game for the community's 2021 Jam. That year's demo disc would contain a demo of Toree 3D, with the full release coming 1 month later. As such, Toree 3D is meant to include light elements of horror, which I'll get more into during the review. The idea of a cutesy-looking 3D platformer having something more nefarious under the hood is pretty clever, if a bit cliché, but has the potential for something pretty interesting. The most notable aspect of Toree's release, however, was the Switch port by Diplodocus Games. They had previously ported Cyactro's MacBat64 to the Switch, so a port for Toree 3D was an easy way to give the game a bigger audience. It worked really well, and the successful launch caught a lot of people by surprise. Toree had made its way more into the mainstream of indie gamers, and had even done well enough to warrant a sequel. Shortly after that sequel was released, however, Toree 3D got an extra content update called Jumbled Jam, including 4 new levels using existing assets from throughout the base game. This update wasn't actually developed by Cyactro, but by another developer named Caleros. I'll give Jumbled Jam a deeper spotlight later in the video though. With development stuff out of the way, let's take a closer look at the game itself. Now, normally I start with the story in these videos, but when it comes to story, Toree 3D is lacking, to say the least. There's almost nothing to talk about here. No intro cutscene, no dialogue, nothing. The most you get are a few small contextual clues as to what's going on and why you're here, like right at the start of this first level, where you see this hooded figure laughing maniacally while holding an ice cream cone, only for him to fly away as you give chase. Essentially, the story is that this guy stole your ice cream, so you're chasing him across the world to get it back. Eventually, you chase it all the way to its world, where you retrieve your ice cream and live happily ever after. The fact that none of this is directly communicated and I was only able to piece it together after I beat the game means that the story fails to contextualize the gameplay in any meaningful way until it's too late and the game is already over. However, I feel that pretty much anyone playing this game would be happy to just have some levels to run and jump through and not care whether or not there's a story at all, myself included. I would have liked some kind of intro cutscene, but it's not a deal breaker. What I really want to talk about in this story section then is the horror elements. Who exactly is this guy? Well, it doesn't get a name, but it's clearly some kind of supernatural being, bridging Toree's video game world with our own. You can see lines of game code in these rifts left behind in its path of destruction, innocent background elements being transformed into something more nightmarish, and these freaky abominations littered throughout the otherwise cheery-looking worlds. It's a clever subversion of such a happy and cartoony-looking setting, and it all culminates in the final level, where elements from every previous level have been transported to this otherwise desolate void. All this sounds great on paper, but in execution, the build-up feels a little lacking. If it were up to me, I would have had the earlier levels show little bits of disturbance here and there, but by the end of the adventure, levels are falling apart as the interdimensional creatures start to take over more and more. In the game as it is, almost every level is like 95% normal with a few small things out of the ordinary, like these code rifts that make creepy sounds or the occasional jump scare. It's almost got what it needs to be a truly subversive and interesting horror experience while simultaneously delivering a fun and satisfying platforming adventure, but it falls just short of going the extra mile in the horror department. To be fair, I'd rather the game be skewed more towards platforming than horror, since at the end of the day, platforming is what Toree does best in terms of gameplay, but this is a clever concept, and I wish it was fleshed out just a little bit more. The technicals are probably the element where Toree drops the ball the most. I really like the graphical art style, the low-poly aesthetic is super charming, and the simplistic character models are really cute. It also sports some solid themes for its levels, including Neon City rooftops, a Sonic Adventure 2-esque harbor, this ending section is most definitely inspired by that game, a snowy ice world with these pretty-looking crystals dotted around, and a hectic traffic jam. If anything makes these themes stand out the most, it's the color palettes. My god, these levels are pretty! From the bright pink buildings of the rooftop levels to the moody blues of the traffic jam levels, it's super vibrant and expressive. I love the way the game looks, don't get me wrong, but I do have some complaints on the more technical side of things. Really, it's the little things that bug me, like you can change the music volume in the options, but not the sound effects. And no, this doesn't control both. If you lower the music, the sound effects will still be at max volume. I really don't understand why an extra slider for sound effect volume couldn't have been added here. Options are generally lacking pretty hard. There's nothing in the way of accessibility, control remapping, or even basic video options, not even a full screen toggle. None of the menus can be navigated with a D-pad on any of my controllers, DualSense, Xbox Series, or Switch Pro, and going back in the menus sometimes doesn't work and will get you stuck in a loop of returning to the same screen you're already on. You can't even skip the credits, which is annoying when trying to S-rank the final level because you're forced to either sit through the entire credit sequence or quit the game and reopen it just to try it again. Don't get me wrong, these are not game breakers at all, but I bring them up because I think they're all fairly simple things to fix. Just adding a few options would help a lot in making the game feel more well-rounded. You may have noticed an option for new soundtrack in my little ramble there, and indeed, this game does feature 2 whole soundtracks. The soundtrack that the game launched with was not original, and all came from a pre-existing music library. That said, my god was the classic soundtrack perfect. Every song fit the level's themes perfectly and were really fun to listen to, with my favorites being the menu theme and Its World. A few months after launch, however, thanks to the game's success, Cyactro commissioned a full original soundtrack for Toree 3D, featuring a unique theme for all 9 levels, plus a new menu theme and victory jingle. This is technically better than the classic soundtrack's 5-level themes, which reused songs for each pair of levels based on their visual themes. I do appreciate the extra content, but I did find the classic soundtrack a little better. Those songs were just absolute bangers, and the new soundtrack does have its fair share of bangers. I'm a fan of the new rooftop and harbor level themes, but on the whole, it's just not quite as good as the classic soundtrack. That's far from a complaint though, as you can toggle between them at any time, and 2 soundtracks is better than 1. Overall, no matter which soundtrack you pick, you'll have good music to jump around to. So far, I haven't really explained exactly why I love Toree 3D as much as I do. In fact, I've probably been more critical than positive, but that's just because I would love to see those small issues ironed out in a sequel. A perfect Toree game would not be that hard to make considering the foundation here in Toree 3D is already rock solid. But what makes it so good? Even a basic look at the controls and level design philosophy of Toree 3D reveals a simple recipe for a fun and charming platformer that checks all of the right boxes for me. Starting off with the controls, they are the definition of simple yet effective. You have a run button, a jump, a double jump, and my favorite move, the squish button. It squishes you, and if you mash it, it does this. This is my favorite thing ever. The controls, while basic, are more than effective in matching the straightforward, set-piece-driven linear level design. Having Mario 64 controls in these levels would only overcomplicate things. Keeping it simple a la Crash 1 is a great way to keep the player focused on engaging with the level's unique mechanics and set pieces. That's where the game really shines. Typically, levels will see you jumping through linear obstacle courses with a variety of hazards to keep things interesting. Toree 3D features a number of obstacles, like moving platforms, wind turbines, and conveyor belts. The first 4 levels mostly keep to just these elements while also introducing enemies, all of which just walk along a set path and kill you if you touch them. The first half gradually increases in difficulty while not shaking up the core foundation of the platforming much at all. Sea Mama's Harbor introduces more verticality to the level design, but the general platforming challenges remain mostly the same. The third set of levels are icy, and that means ice physics. I don't inherently have a problem with ice in platformers, so long as the ice physics are good, and while it's not quite Crash 2 levels of bad, the ice physics here aren't great. When just walking around, they're fine, but as soon as you jump, it instantly throws you in whatever direction you're running, and you lose control of your momentum while in the air if you jumped off of an icy platform. The best way to mitigate this is to jump without holding any direction on the stick as soon as you land from the initial jump. Neutral jumping on ice halts all momentum and leaves you standing in place right there, which is helpful but definitely doesn't feel natural. Before figuring this out, platforming on icy terrain was easily the most frustrating part of the entire game because it feels janky and unnatural, especially with these moving icy platforms. While the ice can be annoying, 95% of the time it's fine, and the rest of the level hazards make for perfectly good platforming challenges. These last 2 levels take everything from the rest of the game and mash them all together while upping the challenge to the max. Long jumps, combining multiple different hazards together, tricky enemy placements, and checkpoints frequent enough to never make it frustrating. The biggest problem I have with Toree 3D's level design is just how much you end up waiting around. Waiting on these moving platforms, waiting for enemies to move, waiting for these trucks to get into place so you can jump across them. It makes the pacing of levels feel more awkward because the rest of the time you're blazing through levels, running across all the hazards as fast as your fingers will let you, but then you suddenly have to just stop and do nothing. It's not a huge deal, but it's probably the worst aspect of the gameplay to me. Aside from that, Toree has a really nice, smooth difficulty curve that culminates in a perfect final level, with plenty of fun obstacles from throughout the main levels mashed together in a climactic, challenging ending. The one problem with that smooth difficulty curve, however, is the Mega Man problem. Much like Mega Man, Toree lets you play any of the 8 main levels in any order and unlocks the final level once you've beaten all 8. My first playthrough, I did the top row in order and then the bottom row, which meant it had a decently smooth difficulty curve at first, but then reset when I went back to the bottom row. Now I know that it's better to play the levels in order of theme for the smoother difficulty curve, but I'd honestly rather have the levels play in a set order to guarantee the gradual rise in challenge. All that said, just running through the levels on their own isn't all that Toree has to offer. As you can see, there are stars littered throughout each level, and their placement feels very natural. They're typically placed along the golden path, but not so much so that you'd grab them just by walking in a straight line through all the obstacles. You'll never be running to every end of every platform just to get them all, so they feel fast and fluid to collect, but they're not so out of the way as to be tedious. These make for a fun little side quest, and getting all the stars in every level unlocks Macbat as a playable character. If there's any star placements I'd have to complain about, it's the ones on these moving platforms at the end of the first level, because if you were to miss one, you'd have no choice but to die and respawn at the last checkpoint to try getting them again. But if you just stay in the center of the platform and don't move, you'll get them all just fine, so it's not a big deal. On top of that, stars stay permanently collected until you exit the stage, so dying and going back to a checkpoint won't mean collecting all the stars after that checkpoint over again. This is greatly appreciated because sometimes they can be tricky when placed near enemies. I really like this extra side quest. It adds a lot of depth to the level design without being overbearing or tedious at all, and you're well rewarded for it, so it gets a thumbs up from me. There are also time trials in this game, where you get ranked from C up to S. These rankings are based solely on your completion time for the level, so optimizing your movement is key. Originally, the game only had ranks up to A, and getting A rank on all levels unlocks Tasty as a playable character. Shortly after the game launched, however, it received its first update, including a new S rank for every level. Some of the gaps between A and S are as big as almost a minute, while others are as small as 4 seconds, so the difficulty in obtaining these S ranks can vary wildly. Most of them are fine, but a couple are just a bit too precise for my liking. Sea Mama's Harbor is so strict that I had to perfect the entire level and even add in this super precise jump to skip half of a cycle in the beginning of the level just so I could save 3 seconds and get the S rank. Neo Osaka requires this impossible looking jump to make all of the rest of the cycles in the level line up, ultimately saving 13 seconds and getting me the S rank. If these cycles were going to be mandatory to make for the S rank, they probably should have been altered slightly so that they line up better. On the whole though, I do really like the addition of time trials, since mastering levels in this way is always super satisfying to me. I just wish they were balanced just a little bit better. Getting S ranks on every level unlocks a golden skin for Toree, and that's a really nice reward for the dedicated folks who push themselves to really perfect the game. I don't need some new mode or character or whatever to feel rewarded for my efforts, just the acknowledgement of my achievement is enough, and a golden skin is perfect for that. It also just looks really cool to me, so maybe I'm just easily impressed. Who knows? Speaking of rewards, let's talk about those extra characters. Macbat gets infinite jumps, just like in Macbat 64, as your reward for beating that game, and flying around the levels to find all sorts of Easter eggs is pretty fun. Tasty is really cool. He runs at double Toree's speed, so he makes for a great character to speedrun the game with. You can do this with Macbat 2 if you like floating in a straight line towards the goal, I guess, but that seems kind of pointless to me. Neither characters have time rankings or their own collectibles or anything, so they more so act as new ways to experience the levels than new modes or anything like that. They're decent rewards for their respective side quests, and I really enjoy messing around with them from time to time, but they aren't going to add an extra hour of playtime or anything like that unless you want to speedrun the game with them. So that's Toree 3D, but we're not quite done yet. Like I said back at the beginning of the video, this game got a free update called Jumbled Jam, with 4 new levels designed by friend to Sayakjo, Kalaros. The update released in October, just 1 month after the release of Toree 2, and it even features some posters advertising the sequel in it, which is pretty cool. Before I get into the analysis though, I've got some more complaining to do here. The Switch version of the update is accessible from the main game's main menu, and as a result, you can use any of your unlocked characters from the main campaign in these levels. But on PC, it's not included in either the itch or Steam releases of Toree 3D. Rather, it got its own separate release exclusively on itch, and doesn't implement any of the unlockables from the main game, even if you do get all the stars or A ranks or S ranks. This makes absolutely no sense to me. It should have just been a free update to the main game like it was on the Switch version, but whatever. Back to the actual game. Each level takes inspiration and reuses assets from one of the level themes from the main campaign. It's essentially one big third level for each theme, but they follow a very different design philosophy from the base game's levels. Levels are now way longer, with big platforms and wide open areas. There are way more stars, with every level having over 100 to collect, with a couple nearing 200, while the main game only had 50 to 95 stars in each level. Stars are now spammed all over every platform, no longer retaining the elegant placement I praised of the main game's levels. One thing I do like about Jumbled Jam's level design is the way it experiments a lot more with verticality. You'll be climbing up huge buildings and falling down massive pits, and that's pretty fun. On the whole though, the pacing feels a lot more bloated due to the bigger levels and star spam. The ice level in particular was really annoying, with these tiny platforms over a big bottomless pit and stars placed all around it, with the holes in the ice platforms being janky and awkward. I do like that there are some custom assets made for this expansion. It helps to make it feel a little more unique, but the actual level design just doesn't play to Toree's strengths as well as the main campaign did. It's not bad, and I certainly applaud Caloros's effort in adding to the original game and experimenting with it in unique ways, but sometimes certain design elements just don't mesh as well. Really, the biggest disappointment for me was not getting any of the unlockables that the main game had, even after 100%ing the expansion, just because I'm playing on the PC version. That was pretty lame. I'm glad this expansion exists, it's cool and still pretty fun to play, but it didn't really impress me as much as the main game did. So that was Toree 3D, a brilliant and promising new IP that shows so much potential in its simple yet fun and fast-paced gameplay. While it stumbles in a few small areas like technical issues and some minor pace-breaking instances of waiting around, it's overall a fun time that's more than worth the price tag of just $1. If you haven't played this game yet, definitely pick it up. Next time we'll be looking at the sequel, Toree 2, to see how it iterates on the formula and possibly capitalizes on the potential of Toree 3D. Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the review, and if you want to support me directly, you can donate to my Patreon. Link in the end card and description. See you next time!